Okay, so have you ever gotten like this feeling that the ocean is just like side-eyeing us, like it's not really happy with how we've been treating it?
Yeah, well, you're not alone. Because after diving deep into all this material that you guys sent in, especially that article, Why the Oceans Hate Humans, let's just say it's not pretty. We're going to be unpacking a lot of those hard truths today, but we're also going to be looking for those like little glimmers of hope. And most importantly, what you can do to make a difference.
It's very easy to just get overwhelmed by like the sheer size of these problems,
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
think the key is to focus on what we can actually do about it.
Exactly. But before we get to the solutions, we've got to understand like what the problems actually are. And this article, Why the Oceans Hate Humans, it doesn't hold back at all. It starts right out of the gate with this absolutely crazy statistic. 8 million tons of plastic are going into the ocean every year. Can you even like picture that? That's like an entire garbage truck full of plastic being dumped into the ocean every single minute. It's mind-boggling, isn't it? I think it really shows just like how much plastic there is in our society. But I think beyond that shock value, we need to understand like why this is happening. A lot of it comes down to how much we consume and how we manage our waste,
Hmm.
especially in developing countries.
So it's not just about people, just being careless with their plastic.
Yeah, it's not just the individual. It's really a systemic issue. We need to look at like the whole life of plastic from when it's made to when we throw it away.
Right.
And of course, the ocean is downstream from everything, so it ends up being like the final resting place for a lot of our garbage.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Now, the article dives into like the three big ways that we're really messing up the oceans. Obviously, plastic pollution, that's a big one, but also ocean acidification and overfishing. I have to say, like the overfishing one, that one really hit me hard.
Yeah.
The fact that 90% of big fish populations are gone, like
Yeah.
tuna, sharks, marlin, it's really heartbreaking.
Yeah. It is a crazy statistic, and it really shows just how bad unsustainable fishing is. Basically, we're taking fish out of the ocean faster than they can reproduce. So the populations get really low.
So it's kind of like we're treating the ocean like an all-you-can-eat buffet.
Yeah.
And we're just like taking and taking without even thinking about what's going to happen next.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. We need to stop thinking about just taking from the ocean and start thinking about how to protect it if we want to have healthy fish populations for future generations.
Right, because it's going to affect us too in the end. Seafood is a major source of protein for billions of people around the world.
Exactly. When fish populations decline, it affects the economy and society, especially for people who live on the coast and depend on fishing to make a living.
Okay, so overfishing, that's a huge problem. But I'm kind of curious about ocean acidification. I get as the ocean absorbs CO2 from the air, but how does that make it more acidic? And like, what does that actually do to the stuff that lives in the ocean?
It's basically like Chemistry 101. When CO2 dissolves in water, it turns into carbonic acid, and that makes the water more acidic. Even a small change in the pH can have a huge effect on marine life.
The article mentioned that coral reefs are super vulnerable to this.
Yeah, coral reefs are really sensitive to changes in ocean acidity. The acid actually dissolves the calcium carbonate that their skeletons are made of, so they become weak and eventually they die. And coral reefs are really important for so many reasons. They're home to tons of different species, they protect coastlines from erosion, and they support tourism and fishing.
So it's like this domino effect. One change leads to a bunch of other bad things.
Exactly. Ocean acidification also affects shellfish like oysters and clams. It makes it harder for them to grow their shells, and that has a ripple effect through the whole food web, and eventually it impacts the entire ecosystem.
Yeah, I'm starting to see how everything is connected. We can't just look at these problems on their own. So we've covered the big three: plastic pollution, overfishing, and ocean acidification. But the article goes into some pretty wild, specific examples of what's actually happening out there. Should we dive into those?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get into some of those shocking and frankly scary realities of how humans are impacting the oceans. All right, so let's talk about some of these like really crazy examples. You mentioned the Great Pacific Garbage Patch earlier, and what's really shocking about it isn't just how big it is. Like the article said, it's twice the size of Texas. But it's not actually a solid island of trash like a lot of people think.
Right. It's more like this like soup of plastic pieces just floating around. And a lot of it's microplastics, those tiny little pieces. Honestly, when I read that there are 1.8 trillion pieces of plastic in it, my brain just like couldn't even process it. That's like 200 pieces for every person on Earth.
I know it's hard to even imagine. And the really scary thing is that all of those microplastics don't just stay in that one patch. They get into the food chain. Tiny little organisms eat them, and then small fish eat those organisms, and then bigger fish eat those fish, and so on.
And eventually, it ends up on our plates.
Yeah.
It's pretty disturbing to think that something that started out as a plastic bottle could end up in my sushi.
Yeah, exactly. It shows how everything we do affects the ocean. Even something as small as using a plastic straw or buying a bottle of water.
Speaking of things that are hard to imagine the scale of, the article also talked about these things called ghost nets. They're basically these giant fishing nets, sometimes miles long, that are just abandoned in the ocean. They trap and kill all kinds of marine life. Can you imagine a net the size of like several football fields, just full of like hundreds of trapped fish, sea turtles, dolphins? It's like an underwater horror movie.
Yeah, it's a really disturbing thought. And the article mentioned that these nets are made from these super durable materials, so they can last in the ocean for decades. And they just become these like killing machines. It really shows you how our actions can have these unintended consequences, even when we're trying to do something like provide food.
And then there's this crazy fact that the ocean can actually catch on fire. I remember seeing that footage of the fire tornado in the Gulf of Mexico a few years ago. It was like something out of a disaster movie.
Yeah, that was a really shocking incident. It was caused by a ruptured gas pipeline.
Yeah.
And it really showed the dangers of offshore drilling. It's not just the risk of oil spills and fires, but also all the noise pollution that comes from those operations.
Right. The article talked about noise pollution as being this big problem that most people don't even think about.
Yeah, exactly. The ocean is a world of sound. Lots of animals, especially whales and dolphins, rely on sound to communicate and to navigate and find food. But all the noise from ships and sonar and oil and gas exploration creates this like wall of sound that disrupts their natural behaviors. It can make them disoriented and stressed, and it can even cause physical harm.
So it's kind of like trying to have a conversation at a rock concert. You can barely hear yourself think, let alone talk to someone else.
Exactly. Now imagine trying to communicate with someone across a huge distance like whales do. All that noise can make it impossible for them to find mates or food, or even avoid predators.
It's just another way that what we're doing on land is affecting the ocean.
Yeah.
And then there are these things called dead zones. They're basically areas in the ocean that have almost no oxygen, so almost nothing can live there. It's like an underwater desert. The article said that there's one in the Gulf of Mexico that's over 6,000 square miles. How do these dead zones even form?
It's kind of complicated, but one of the main causes is runoff from farms. Fertilizers that are used on farms contain nitrogen and phosphorus, and when those chemicals get washed into rivers, they eventually end up in the ocean. Those extra nutrients cause huge algal blooms, and when all those algae die and decompose, they use up a ton of oxygen in the water, and that creates those dead zones.
So even how we produce our food is impacting the ocean. It's pretty overwhelming to think about all these problems.
Yeah, it can be daunting, but it's important not to give up hope. The article does talk about some things we can do to make a difference. Should we look at those?
I know, right? It's like you've been on this deep dive into the dark side of the ocean. But you're right. It's not all doom and gloom. The article does give us some hope. I think that's what we need to focus on now. Like, what can we actually do about all this?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's easy to feel helpless when you're dealing with these giant global problems.
Right.
But the article reminded me that the ocean is pretty resilient. Even small changes can make a difference.
Okay, so let's talk solutions. The article mentions cutting down on plastic as a big one. What are some things that people can do every day to use less plastic?
Well, it really starts with just noticing how much plastic you're using. You'd be surprised how easy it is to just make a few simple changes.
Like what?
Like bring your own bags to the grocery store, ditch those single-use water bottles and get a reusable one, skip the plastic straws, or even better, carry your own reusable straw. These things might seem small, but they really add up.
Yeah, I've been trying to be more mindful about my plastic use, and it's definitely becoming more of a habit. What about seafood? I love sushi, but I don't want to be contributing to overfishing.
Right.
So what can we do to make sure we're eating seafood responsibly?
There are some great resources out there, like the Monterey Bay Aquarium's Seafood Watch program. They have an app that tells you how sustainable different kinds of seafood are. Basically, you want to look for seafood that was caught or farmed in a way that doesn't harm the environment.
So just doing a little research before you order can really help.
Totally. And don't be afraid to ask questions at the seafood counter or when you're at a restaurant. The more we demand sustainable seafood, the more things will change.
Okay, so we've got reducing plastic use, choosing sustainable seafood.
Yeah.
What else can we do?
Supporting organizations that are working to protect the ocean is a big one.
Right.
There are some amazing groups out there doing research and advocating for change and cleaning up the ocean. Even a small donation can make a difference. And getting involved locally can be really impactful too. You could join a beach cleanup or participate in a citizen science project, or even just learn more about these issues and talk to other people about them.
Yeah, it's good to know that we're not totally powerless, but the article also made it clear that the ocean isn't just sitting around waiting for us to fix things. It's sending us some pretty serious warning signs, like things are getting really bad.
Yeah, definitely. We're seeing the consequences of our actions more and more, like rising sea levels are threatening coastal communities. And we're seeing more intense hurricanes because the ocean is getting warmer. And ocean acidification is damaging coral reefs and other ecosystems.
I remember that line from the article, the oceans see everything, and they're keeping receipts. That's pretty powerful.
It is. It reminds us that our actions have consequences. Everything on Earth is connected, so when we mess up one part, it affects the whole thing.
So what does all this mean for us, for the future? Like, if we don't change, what's going to happen?
Well, the article makes it pretty clear that the stakes are high. We could see fisheries collapse, millions of people could be displaced by rising sea levels, and we could lose a huge amount of biodiversity. But I don't want to end on a totally negative note. I really do believe that we can turn things around.
I agree. We have to choose to act, and we have to act now. This deep dive has been a real wake-up call for me, and I hope it's been the same for you guys listening. We've talked about a lot today. The bad stuff like pollution and overfishing, but also the good stuff, like all the amazing work that people are doing to protect the ocean and the things that we can all do to help.
Yeah, we've just scratched the surface, but hopefully we've made you curious and maybe even inspired you to do something. Keep learning, keep exploring, and keep asking questions. The future of the ocean and our own future depends on it.